Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pocket Size Bio with Dr. Casco. This video begins a series of lectures with Campbell Biology, right? And Campbell Biology is a gold standard, if I can say, textbook that many undergraduate students use or AP Biology students use. And I have yet to see full lectures of individual chapters on YouTube. So I wanted to kind of tackle this endeavor here. So today we're going to talk about chapter one. And I do want to note that my videos are pretty much showing notes that encompass every chapter, all the content of every chapter, and the visuals, right? So you can see what I'm discussing and so forth. I primarily use this blue one you see here, the Campbell Biology, but if you're using biology, a global approach, that is also fine. There's some discrepancies between the chapter allocations, but ultimately it's, if I can say, identical content, right? So anywhere where that occurs, I will let you guys know. Okay, just a little bit about myself, guys, and kind of what I'm doing. So, my name is Roman Casco. I'm a PhD holder in cell biology, and I focus my studies on regenerative physiology, right? And I do academic mentorship to undergraduate students and high schoolers, right? So they can publish their work in high school journals or attend conferences. So far, all my students that I have mentored have had a 100% success rate. And if you need some mentorship, I can provide one-on-one lessons for you, right? If you want to start a research project from zero, or if you need help, you already started something and you need help on certain experiments or data analysis or writing the manuscript, I can help you with that, right? So you can book a lesson with me on Preply or Preply, and the link is in the description. All right, enough about me, guys. Let's get started with the chapter. Okay, so we begin Campbell Biology, of course, from the beginning, Unit 1, Evolution, and the themes of biology and scientific inquiry, right? So the key concepts we're going to talk about is just characteristics of life, certain core themes that encompass biology, which is evolution, right? And a little bit of the nature of science, which is encompassed in the scientific method. Okay, so this is a nice little depiction here that kind of gives you a scope of what we're going to talk about, right? In figure 1.1, it says the light apple color of this beach mouse allows it to blend into its habitat. Brilliant white sand dunes dotted with sparse clumps of beach grass along the Florida seashore. Mice of the same species that inhabit nearby inland areas are much darker, blending with the soil and vegetation where they live. Right, so we're going to focus on this idea of um, biology and the themes that encompass biology, evolution, how we have certain levels of organization in our body, and even as we get into a broader scope of biology, right? We have ecosystems and communities and populations, um, how everything is kind of organized. Aside from that, we dive into the organism and how an individual organism works in terms of genetic information and gene expression, and how matter and energy cycle between the non-living components of Earth and, of course, the biotic aspect of Earth, right? Living organisms. Okay, so we get into section 1.1 that I'm going to kind of break it down into. So, section one or concept one, the study of life reveals, right, unifying themes. Okay, it's a little difficult to fully answer, right? What is life? It's a very simple question, but it can be broken down into fairly complex parts. Oh, sorry. Okay, we could recognize some key features about what defines us as living organisms and sets us apart from rocks or soil, so to say. Okay. So it is enormous in scope, right? The whole study of biology is the scientific study of life. And it is broken down into several concepts or themes, right? Organization, information processing, energy and matter interactions between our living organisms and other living organisms and non-living things, and evolution. Here you can see some examples of the properties of life we're going to get into also. Okay, living organisms, they tend to exhibit order, right? They tend to show a change over time where they adapt to their environment, evolutionary adaptation, regulation where organisms are able to cope with their environment under changing conditions, right? Energy processing, one way or another, we all must have energy within our body or else we will die, right? Um, Growth and development. All organisms from the moment that they're formed, that they're given birth to, right? They need to um, produce new features, grow in size, so they can survive and thrive in their environment. Without that being said, we can't just be in an environment. We also need to respond to the things inside our environment, right? So response to the environment is very critical. And of course, although it's not critical to have as a property of life, we do need to reproduce, or else our whole species will disappear, right? We're not infinite. We don't have an infinite lifespan. Um, we're born, we grow, we reproduce, we die, right? But we need to continue the species. So this is a feature of life. Okay. So the first theme we're going to tackle is new properties emerge at successive levels of biological organization. Okay, so the study of life, we have different scales, if I can say, right? We have the microscopic scale. Sorry, again, I have a little typo here. All right, can extend from different scales of organization. We have the microscopic, where you're talking about the individual organism and going inside the organism, and even talking about individual cells, going even further with macromolecules, right? Uh, to the macroscopic. From the individual, you go further to the population, many individuals, right? Human society, as an example, getting into where we live, the community of other living organisms, to a whole ecosystem, to the entire planet, even the biosphere. So, more in detail, this is an example of what I'm talking about, right? This panel here. You have the broadest scope, which is the biosphere. It encompasses all ecosystems around the world. And so forth, right? Then if you zoom into a particular location, get a little bit more defined, you have an ecosystem. Very specific abiotic factors, right? Temperature, the overall climate, um, the type of organisms that are living within that particular area. Into a community. Communities are basically referring to only living organisms, right? Here you see a picture of certain deer and plant species. Okay, within a specific area. Then you get into populations, right? Just one specific kind of species. All right. Could be just a species of deer, species of rabbits or rodents, etc. Okay. Into that individual organism, the plant, we're getting more and more specific. Okay. Within that organism, we get further down. That individual organism then turns, you break down that organism into several of its parts, basically the organs. We're all familiar with this, right? You have your heart, you have your stomach, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, there's some more refinement that needs to be shown here, the organ systems, right? But we get into that later on in the chapters. So our organs get into the tissues. Several tissues are several cells, similar cells working together. to create an overall function. Okay. Here you have an example of a leaf, several tissues within the leaf, several cells within the leaf to create an overall process of photosynthesis. You zoom in more into that, you have your cells. Okay. You have a plant cell. Within that plant cell, you have organelles, right? You have the nuclei, you have the mitochondria, you have the chloroplast. Here you can see an example of an organelle, which is the chloroplast. And further down, you have a particular molecule. Okay. In this case, you have chlorophyll molecule. Every single scale, has some certain characteristics that execute a function. When they work in concert with other or um, structures, they can create a new property, right? That we're going to take a look at in the next thing. Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me go down a little bit. So this is what I was referring to in terms of properties. They're referred to as emergent properties, right? And these are properties that come about due to interaction or arrangement of particular parts, structures. And then as you have this interaction, complexity tends to increase, right? You have chloroplast producing, or carrying out the process of photosynthesis, right? But the chloroplast in itself, that organelle, requires many different proteins. It requires chlorophyll to absorb light to even start off that process, right? So you have to have several components, and you need to have an interaction between these components, right, or coordination. If not, you're just going to have a mix of many things, but nothing's really happening, right? So when you have that coordination occurring, then you get an emergent property. Okay. And then so that idea of emergent properties and kind of getting different components and putting them together is in a nutshell called systems biology, right? You're exploring biological systems by analyzing interactions between, whatever parts you're focusing on. Okay. It could be a single leaf. It could be a whole organism like a frog. It could be a colony of ants, right? What's their behavior, their individual behavior, and then as a whole, right? It could be an entire ecosystem. So it's a broad concept, but it defines the point of emergent properties. Okay. Within a systems biology, we're going to focus on dynamic behaviors, right? And dynamic behaviors tends to open up more questions, right? Um, Molecular interactions or your whole metabolic machinery, how does it influence the sleep cycle of a person? And how can you alter that sleep cycle? So there are many scales you can kind of discuss or research, right? Carbon dioxide levels affect biosphere and alter ecosystems, right? To what degree can they affect, the individual or particulars of an ecosystem and so forth, right? Okay, so talking about structure and function. So these are some of the properties I was mentioning in terms of properties of life. Okay. So structure and function, a very, very important principle. You're going to see this many times throughout the year, throughout the whole context of the book, that the way something gets structured will kind of define the way that it works, right? And in a simple example, you have the flat shape of leaves, right? We've all seen how leaves are. We've experienced them since we were kids. We've interacted with them. They're structures that are incredibly flat. Of course, there are exceptions with adaptations and things like that, but just your standard leaves. And the reason why it's flat is to maximize surface area exposure that you can have for sunlight, right? So you can produce photosynthesis, more glucose production, more energy for the organism. Okay, so analyzing biological structure can give a clue as to what it does and how it actually functions, how it works. The wing of a hummingbird, the anatomical structure of a hummingbird is quite unique that it enables wing rotation within the structure. right? So this gives the hummingbird a higher degree of rotation, of freedom of movement in comparison to other birds. Okay. So this is an example of what I mean by structure and function. We're going to see this in a lot more detail in the later sections. All right. One of the main key properties of life is the cell. Okay. So an organism's basic unit of structure and function. So this is what kind of defines, if I can say, um, life, right? So cells are the smallest unit of organization that can perform all activities required for life. We're going to see cells all throughout. This is a electron microscope image of a cell. There's two types of cells you see here. Here's an eukaryotic cell. You can think about it as an animal cell for now. And here you see a little bacterial cell, prokaryotic cell, with their adequate size comparison. Very small compared to an eukaryotic cell. Okay. So this idea that cells, are the necessary structure for life, right, comes about by this idea of the cell theory, first developed in the 1800s, based on many observations from scientists, trying to figure out what we're made up of. And one of the components of this cell theory is that all living organisms are made up of cells, and the cell is the basic unit of life. Okay. And again, this is a theory which I don't want to just brush it off. As we're going to see later on in this chapter, theories have a substantial amount of evidence to support this generalization. Okay. So don't take this idea lightly. Most likely, if you find an organism or some entity that resembles a living organism, most likely they're going to have cells. Okay. But there's so many different types of cells. All right, approximately 200 different types of cells within humans, but they share certain characteristics amongst all of them. Okay, one of them is a membrane. Okay, so if you see here, you have these structures here that you have these cells that have a bunch of things inside of it, but how do you keep it? Sorry, how do you keep it all within this structure, right? You have to have some type of boundary, some type of border. So this is what the membrane is, right? The membrane regulates materials coming in, material leaving the cell, and just keeps everything packed within this structure. There are two types of cells that I kind of mentioned beforehand, right? Prokaryotic cells, and they belong to the groups of bacteria. Bacteria and archaea belong to this group, and they're pretty much single-celled organisms, means that they only consist of one little cell. And you have eukaryotic cells, much more complex, much bigger, as we're going to see later on. And these could be single-celled organisms or multicellular organisms composed of different cells, right? Or multiple cells. Eukaryotic cells, like I mentioned before, as I'm mentioning, right? They contain membrane-enclosed organelles. We're going to see this in a little bit. They contain DNA, which is housed within a very special organelle called the nucleus. Okay, and you can see this, the nuclear structure here, and DNA is found within. Um, Many types of organelles, these small little structures that you see, these globular little structures are organelles. Okay, and many of them have their own membrane. An example of organelles is chloroplast. You also have the endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondria, okay? Many more that we're going to describe. And eukaryotic cells are generally larger than prokaryotic cells, as you see here in this micrograph. Okay, let's continue. All right, going to the next theme there. Life processes involve the expression and transmission of genetic information, right? So this is another key element of life, the idea of Having genetic information, right? Having DNA, expressing the information that's contained in that DNA to produce a protein to make the organism function properly. And of course, you want to pass down this information from parent to offspring, parent to offspring. Okay. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let's get into a little bit of the essentials, right? So, what is this information, the structure of information that I keep talking about, right? Essentially, it's DNA. Okay, structures known as chromosomes. They contain genetic material in the form of deoxyribonucleic acid, commonly known as DNA. We all have heard of DNA. We all can get a sense of what it is, right? And the idea of DNA, right? It's the control center of the cell. It contains that information to create protein, right? But other than that, it's also necessary to copy this information, pass it down from one cell to another as it divides, right? The idea of cell dividing is referred to as mitosis and cell division. And when that occurs, the DNA needs to copy itself, right? It undergoes several processes of condensation. It condenses into these rod-like structures, right? So you can equally divide the cell and the same amount of DNA to two new cells, right? Here's a colored micrograph, a stained micrograph of a cell that has its copy of DNA, right? And they've condensed into chromosomes, and it's undergoing cell division, right? Here it seems to be in an anaphase, and then it's passing through and splitting into two new cells. Basically, you have telophase occurring here. And what I want you to see is that in blue is indicated by DNA, right? The DNA is indicated in blue. Each new cell that's about to form will have its own copy of DNA. Again, we're going to see this process in a lot more detail, step by step later on. Okay. So, talking a little bit about DNA more in detail. Yes, it is the genetic information. Okay. Sorry about the noise outside. Okay. Sorry about the noise outside. Yes, DNA, the genetic material, right? So, a chromosome. So I talked about chromosome before, right? It's a long strand of DNA that could vary depending on the species, on how much information it's carrying, but it can carry 100 to 1,000 different types of genes, right? And a gene is just a particular section of DNA. And a gene encodes a information to create a protein, to build a protein. And depending on how you use these genes, how you turn on some genes, how you leave off some other genes, it gives a cell a certain identity, right? That's how we can kind of distinguish and develop different types of cells. All right. So when we are first conceived, right? When you have an egg cell and a sperm cell undergoing fertilization, here you have your fertilized egg, you have a new individual, right? It starts as one cell, but it contains all the genetic information in that one cell. As the cell divides and divides and divides, right? Different cells are starting to have a kind of an orchestra of different genes turning off and on for certain periods of time to turn into and develop into that individual. In this case, you have this little baby here, human baby. Okay. Oh my goodness. All right. So yes, as the cell is being as is fertilized and you produce its new individual, the cell needs to copy itself. sorry, the DNA needs to copy itself. The cell divides. As the cell is dividing and dividing and dividing, DNA is copying and copying and copying, right? So every new cell has its own set of DNA. Okay, so I've been talking about DNA here and DNA there. What is, how does DNA actually look like and what is it composed of? Right, so going a little bit lower here, the molecular structure of DNA accounts for its ability to store information, right? Remember, structure fits function, right? So DNA is made up of two long chains. Each individual chain looks something like this, okay? And there are essentially two chains that are interacting together and they're coiled up into a helix. So you can see this little blue area here, right? The backbone of the sugar phosphate backbone, uh, where two strands are entangled within each other, amongst each other. Okay, so you have these strands or chains. They're arranged in a double helix. And what makes a strand, a chain, is essentially four types of building blocks that are repeating in a particular order. All right, they're abbreviated A, T, C, and G, and they stand for adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. You can see them here. This little diagram representation here. This is a nucleotide, right? Each of these four letters are referred to as nucleotides, and a specific sequence of nucleotides provides information to create a specific protein, right, or a specific amino acid that we're going to see later on. Okay, so sequence is incredibly important in genetics, right, in gene expression. This is one key thing you need to always remember, right? The specific sequence of a nucleotide will determine the information that is being carried, ultimately creating a specific amino acid or polypeptide, which will produce a specific protein. Okay, just to give a little analogy here, you have RAT, rat. Rat is one word. Tar is another word. Art is another word, a different word, right? They mean different things. So similarly to that, the DNA has the same kind of process, right? Where these four different types of building blocks, these nucleotides, right? They're arranged differently, so they produce something new. Okay? Definitely, we see this in a lot more detail as we go along. Okay. So continuing on with the concept of genes and proteins and gene expression, right? Um, so like I mentioned before, right? Genes that are protein encoding, right? They control protein production, right? Because they have that information to produce that protein. A related molecule, right, for DNA to kind of help with the protein production is referred to as RNA. And it serves as an intermediate molecule to carry out information. Okay. So if you want to produce a protein, you undergo this particular process. From DNA, like we saw the little molecule, you have a process called transcription, which creates a RNA molecule. That RNA molecule serves as a kind of temporary blueprint, which undergoes a process called translation, where you have a protein using that information to manufacture um, a protein is going to be manufactured, right, in a particular sequence there. That overall process of getting information, passing it from DNA all the way to um, basically the factory, which is a ribosome, is referred to as gene expression. Okay, gene expression. Here you can see a breakdown, a visual breakdown of what's happening, right? In the nucleus, we have DNA. There's a specific sequence of DNA. It creates an intermediate molecule called RNA. This process is called transcription. Transcription holds the information to produce protein. This is called translation. And proteins have a different building block called amino acids, right? And ultimately, you have this sequence of amino acids to produce a protein that has now it creates its overall structure, ultimately to produce its function. In this case, the book gives an example of crystalline, right? Crystalline is a transparent protein that is used inside the formation of the lens, okay? Which is, of course, fundamental for our eyeball. Okay. So, it's okay if you don't understand everything completely right now. So this is just a very broad overview of genetics, right? And gene expression. Okay. Different organisms, this is something quite interesting, right? The different organisms, they employ essentially the same genetic code, that same process. Sequence of nucleotides will produce a protein. Okay, many species around within this living world, right? Difference between organisms reflect differences between DNA sequences. Yes, you different species have different sequences of DNA, but nevertheless, the process in which you go from DNA to protein is relatively similar. So this brings me to one of the main um, um, themes of biology. The universality of the genetic code is a strong piece of evidence, right? That all life is related. And we are all related to each other in one way or another because of the simple fact that we use the same process, right? So, um, going into a little bit of detail with RNA, an RNA molecule, right? RNA molecules, they, especially in recent times and in research, right? Um, RNA is a single-stranded nucleic acid, right? And it serves as a component of a organelle called the ribosome, and that's where the machinery to create the protein occurs, right? Or is located, right? So it serves as a component for cellular machinery, but RNA can also regulate a gene encoding for a protein, right? So it has regulatory functions and it has structural functions, right? Very critical for gene expression. So, getting a little bit aside, genomics, studying, we've been talking about the idea of DNA sequencing, sequence turning into RNA to produce a protein. The study of all the DNA in your body, right? And with the use of computational biology is essentially called genomics, right? Where scientists have developed incredibly large libraries of genes, right? Um, and to analyze. Okay. All the genes in our body is referred to as the genome, and that analysis of the genome is referred to as genomics. Okay. So scientists have accomplished and have sequenced many organisms, including humans. So imagine if you knew all the genes in your body and you know how they work, right? Then we can um, have more insight to medical applications, right? Biotechnology and so forth. So, gene sequence is essentially the genome sequence is the entire sequence of nucleotides in an individual species. Okay. As I mentioned before, genomics studies the whole set of genes in one or more species. And related to that is proteomics. Proteomics studies all the sets of proteins and the sequence of their proteins and their properties, right, in an individual. And as we go along in the book and we see different types of methods and techniques, right, the scientists have discovered over time and have implemented over time, it's much easier to do gene analysis. But one of the biggest, right, reasons why gene analysis has been able to come about is because of sequencing, right? And nowadays we have high throughput sequencing where you can sequence using a machine. You can actually determine the exact letter sequence of a particular DNA sample, and you can analyze that DNA sample via the study of the implementation of computational tools to manage large sequence data. That is called bioinformatics, right? And ultimately, you need to kind of figure out what is the meaning of all this sequence, right? And that does require a lot of collaboration between mathematicians, biologists, um, computational biologists, right? To have some overall understanding of what it is you want to study and analyze. Okay. So, next theme. Life requires the transfer and transformation of energy and matter. Right. This is a very familiar topic to most of us that we've seen in high school. Right. So, energy and matter. Right. Every activity we do in this life requires energy. Energy is the ability to do work. We need to get energy, right, throughout our day, one way or another. Ultimately, the energy input that comes into these living systems in this world comes from the sun. The majority, the majority. Okay, and it is transformed, right, into usable forms, right? So we know plants, producers, autotrophs, right? These are organisms that can harness the energy of the sun, and you get from light energy and you convert it into chemical energy, right? And sugars, glucose primarily. So, although humans, right, animals can directly produce glucose with light, right? But we consume organisms that do that. Right? Light energy is produced into chemical energy, and then food and that form of energy is passed on to consumers, basically us, heterotrophs. Okay. So you see this nice representation. It all starts from light energy coming from the sun. Energy is flowing into this plant, this autotroph, and this autotroph harnesses that energy, produces glucose. Some consumer, like this worm here, eats that plant. Always, if I can say, in every step within this flow of energy, you're going to have heat being lost in the system. Okay, one way or another. So, consumers, of course, we need energy to do work. We always lose heat as we burn and consume energy. Whoops. So, one of the important things about this, energy flows in one direction. You always start from the sun, you have that highest input of energy. As it's passing through different organisms, you're going to have energy decreasing, more energy is lost as heat. You'll never see energy going backwards, right? It always goes in one direction. Chemicals and matter, though, do cycle. They can go in different ways in different directions. Okay. Um, and when I mean chemicals, I'm talking about oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrates, right? Organic matter. Just as the organism here, you have this little worm that is feeding off the plant. The worm could die into the soil, breaks down by this decomposers. Remaining material could go into the soil, serve as nutrients into the soil for the plant. So you have a cycling of chemicals, right? Um, Going in different directions. But energy only flows in one direction. Okay. Okay. Another theme, next theme. So, from molecules to ecosystems, interactions are important in biological systems. So, as I mentioned before, there's a level of hierarchy, right? Where you have this idea of interactions, right, between components. It's critical. You have to have some interactions because how are you going to know if, you know, you are able to react to something in the environment, right? You have to have interactions. And some examples of this interactions and responses, right, could be regulation of blood sugar levels, right? Body cells must be having the a necessary level of sugar, right, for their or what the work the work that they're doing inside the cells, right? So the body has to be regulating sugar concentrations. If your sugar level's too low, you need a way to bring it back up and so forth, right? So the ability to kind of regulate biological processes is referred to as feedback, a feedback mechanism. Sorry. And there's different types of feedback mechanisms. Okay. But in a nutshell, a feedback regulation or these mechanisms is it's an output, right? Um, a, yeah, the output of a certain process will regulate that very process. It's a little confusing, but we'll take a look at it. The most common one that we think about is negative feedback regulation, where you essentially have a loop, right? Where the response to a particular stimulus reduces the stimulus. Okay. Insulin signaling after a meal, right? And here you have this example. Very nice example here. So you have number one, high blood glucose level stimulates cells in the pancreas. So let's say you just had food, right? You just had food, you have a surge of glucose. There's a lot of glucose in the blood. Okay. High blood glucose level stimulates cells in the pancreas to secrete insulin. Insulin circulates throughout the body. Insulin binds to body cells, and that tells them, hey, we need to consume, we need to collect some glucose and start either burning them or putting them in a storage mode form, right, called glycogen. And that will lower the uh, the glucose concentration, right? That lowered glucose concentration does not stimulate insulin production because there's not that much. Okay, so insulin will help regulate its own stimulus, right? Negative feedback mechanisms. Okay, and then there you have another form called positive feedback regulation. Here, positive feedback means that it kind of reinforces so the end product that you're making will speed up even more production. Okay, so one common example is clotting of your blood in response to injury, right? If you get an injury, you get a cut, right? This will kind of trigger a reaction, right? An inflammatory response for blood clots, platelets to come and aggregate, right? Platelets are particular structures that can help and seal, right, a wound. But as they're sealing and they're coming, they release more chemicals to attract more platelets, right? So you need a different mechanism to stop that from happening because you don't want to overclot. That could lead to a problem. Of course, in a normal situation, we do tend to regulate it well, okay, until the wound is sealed right adequately. Okay, feedback regulation. We're going to see many more examples later on. Okay, you see this form of interactions of feedbacks, um, even on ecosystems, right? So, an ecosystem, right? Just to kind of clarify, there is an organism's interaction with other organisms and the physical environment. At an ecosystem level, organisms they're constantly interacting, right? Very, very interesting here. How you have in this example, you have an acacia tree, right? You have this. Um, you have this organism here. You have the acacia tree. You have soil microorganisms, insects that actually can live within the acacia tree, right? Particularly ants. There's some species of ants that can live within the tree, and some of these acacia trees have little kind of spikes that if a predator comes in and hurts the tree, the ants can come out and attack and defend itself, right? So you have these nice interactions, right, occurring within these organisms. There are many types of interactions. We won't go into many detail in a lot of detail with all of them, but just to name a few, there's mutualistic interactions where you can have both organisms benefiting from each other. You can have a parasitic type of relationship where one organism, the host, is harmed while the parasite is getting benefited, right? You have commensalism, where one organism gets benefited and the other one doesn't, like whales and barnacles. Competition, right? Between plants and, let's say, certain nutrients in the soil. Okay. So organisms are all are in constant interaction with the environment. Okay. Even with abiotic parameters like sunlight, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. We're going to see this later on where you have this cycling of material, right? Plants, they absorb sunlight and they also bring in carbon dioxide inside the leaves, photosynthesis to occur, and as an output, you have oxygen, okay, and so forth. One thing that is interesting about environments is that they're not fixed, right? Environments are dynamic, they change, right? They also, the organisms, they impact on how the environment changes, right? Plant roots, they can break down rocks. Parrotfish, they come in and create sediment because they nibble, they grain on coral, right? So they create a refined sediment, right? Plants and producers, they're providing oxygen to the environment, right? So environments are dynamic, right? They're fluid, they can change based on the behavior of organisms. Okay. So the last part that I want to talk about for concept number one, right? Human interaction has greatly affected the environment, and this is a big problem. There's a whole unit based on human impact, right? In the past 150 years, there's a great increase in um, the burning of fossil fuels, right? We all know fossil fuels consist of coal, oil, gas, all the things we kind of use in our daily life, right? There's a net increase in carbon dioxide output, right? There's an increase in the amount of heat that is trapped in the environment, right? And unfortunately, there's a net increase in the average temperature of the planet, right? Climate change and global warming, um, and so forth, right? So this is one of the biggest things about climate change, that there's been a directional change in the overall temperature, right, of the earth, right? So of course that in itself brings a lot of changes in patterns of climate. You have a lot of more winds, precipitation patterns fluctuate, um, the frequency of extreme weather. If some of you probably know, there's more intense fires, right? Around, I don't want to say around all the world, but in certain locations like California or in Australia, right? So that gives a big impact on living organisms, right? Many living organisms get affected, right? This little table that I've plotted here, organisms affected. You have polar bears, of course, um, gravely affected by climate change. The these ice platforms, right, are melting. So uh, how are they going to thrive if there's no area to kind of thrive in, right? So there's food shortages. If you don't have these platforms to hunt, how are you going to get food? Right? So that's increasing the mortality rates in polar bears. Okay. There could be a point where you're having so much loss of habitat of the environment. Organisms can't move fast enough to migrate. So what happens? Population size decreases or to the point of extinction, right? So very, very important to know this idea of human interaction, of human impact, right? So this finishes section one, concept one of chapter one. Take a look at these questions here, and I'll see you guys in the next video for chapter one, section two. Thank you, guys.